I actually think since 2018, Dallas Goedert's career has been a little disappointing, a little underwhelming. I'll tell you why coming up next in this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to this Thursday edition of the show. We're brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL. You're going to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms, of course, do apply. On today's edition of Locked On Eagles, I got some Dallas Goedert talk for you on Thrown Out of the Nest, our weekly topic every Thursday, weekly segment, I should say, where we have a bolder Eagles opinion that maybe not everybody agrees with. Today's opinion has to do with Dallas Goedert. That's going to be thrown out of the nest, plus free agency. I want to go back to March and April and discuss, although I think the Eagles crushed free agency, there are some moves I wish they would have made, and I'll go back to look at what those moves are, plus the moves that they did make that I think could end up being busts, where we like it on paper, but it doesn't work out. Like, which moves have that potential risk factor? So we'll get into all that and more on today's edition of the show, but I do want to start with Dallas Goedert. Thrown out of the nest, we're talking about Dallas Goedert. Look, Goedert has been one of the best, most dynamic young tight ends in the NFL since he came into the league in 2018. I would say one of the most efficient. He's been one of the best do-it-all blockers, run after the catch tight ends. Like, how many guys in space are better than Goedert at tight end when he has the ball in his hands? Like George Kittle, Travis Kelce. I'm already getting to the bottom of that list. Like, he's been explosive. He's been a great blocker. He's been efficient. He's had some huge years, like 2022. He led the NFL at tight end in yards per reception at almost 15 yards a catch. He had an 800-yard season. What other? A big year 2 years ago, 702 yards. He's had some big playoff moments. Like, I'm not saying Dallas Goedert has been a bust for the Philadelphia Eagles since being a second-round pick they traded up for in 2018. Like, at the time, the Eagles didn't draft him to replace Zach Ertz. They were in a win-now window, coming off a Super Bowl win. They wanted to continue to load up weapons around Carson Wentz and say, hey, we already have a pretty established big three of Zach Ertz, Alshon Jeffrey, and Nelson Aguilar, but we don't really have that true fourth target, and they didn't have that at receiver, so let's go at tight end and bring in Dallas Goedert. Considering what they drafted him for and what he's done since Zach Ertz has left, Dallas Goedert has had a pretty good career. I think the Eagles are very happy with that pick that they made in the second round. So from an Eagles perspective, I'm not saying Dallas Goedert has been a disappointment, but where I'm getting thrown out of the nest here, I would say, is because Dallas Goedert, from his own perspective, considering his talent, his potential, what other tight ends are doing around the league from a production standpoint, and it's not all his fault, but overall, because of a number of variables, I think Dallas Goedert's career in Philadelphia has been a little bit underwhelming for what he could be. And I'm not saying he's Kyle Pitts of the Atlanta Falcons, where he was supposed to be this generational tight end. But Dallas Goedert, again, as I mentioned, is one of the most explosive tight ends in the league. Plus, he's not Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz was a terrible blocker early on in his career. Zach Ertz was not a dynamic run after the catch tight end. He had amazing hands, and he was an amazing separator, a great elite route runner. Like, Zach Ertz had a few things he did really, really well. He was special in a few areas, but he was not nearly as well-rounded of a player as Dallas Goedert. So when you put that all together, the fact that Dallas Goedert has only had 2 seasons where he has surpassed 700 receiving yards. Heck, Brent Selleck did that multiple times in Philadelphia. Brent Selleck had a career high of almost 1,000 receiving yards. Dallas Goedert has never sniffed that. He had 830 back in 2021. The most touchdowns he had was 2019 with 5. He's had years of 4 touchdowns, 3, and 5. So when you look at that production, when you look at the receptions, like the highest was last year with, 59, I think he could have done a lot more in his career. And again, that's not all his fault. A lot of it's circumstance. He didn't choose to be drafted into Philadelphia, where they were when he came in, they were a spread the football around kind of offense. Alshon Jeffrey wasn't a target monster. Like, they didn't have Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. They were spreading it around to Alshon, to Nelson Aguilar, to Zach Ertz. Like, they had just brought in, they had Jay Ajayi still in the backfield and Darren Sproles coming back, a mobile quarterback, and Carson Wentz running the football. So he kind of came into a situation where he was, number one, a backup that didn't even play on the field over 50% of the time. Like, the Eagles split that work with 11 and 12 personnel pretty evenly. He played over 40% of the snaps, but he wasn't a guy playing like what he is now, or playing, he was a backup. Zach Ertz was the starter. So he had to play second fiddle to Zach for the first 4 years of his career. So that wasn't really his fault. He was a backup in that way. And then when Zach Ertz did get traded, they brought in Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, who are absolute, like, this isn't the spread it around Doug Peterson offense anymore. This is, no, the offense runs through, Nick Sirianni has said before, it's Devontae, A.J., and Dallas. But for the most part, this offense runs through number 11 and number 6. So he had to go from being a backup to Zach Ertz in a sharing offense to now an offense that has two of the best receivers in football on the same unit. And so he has to deal with that as well. So when you look at the numbers, like, look at some of Zach Ertz's seasons. He had years where he had 5 straight seasons, and then 6 of 7 seasons where he had over 100 targets. There was a year he had 116 receptions. He went, this stretch is unbelievable. 75 catches, 78, 74, 116, 88. Those years surpassed 800 yards 3 years in a row. Then he had over 1,000. Then he had 916. 2 seasons back-to-back of 8 touchdowns, one where he had 6. And again, Zach Ertz was like the number one go-to guy in a not very talented offense for the majority of his career in Philly. But you'd be kind of disappointed, I think, considering Dallas Goedert's talent, that he's only had 1 year where he's had over 70 targets, or 2 actually, I should say. 3. But he never had a season over 90. He's only had 1 year over 800 yards, 2 over 700, only had 1 5+ touchdown year. I don't know. Again, I'm not saying Dallas Goedert's a bust. This isn't like a crazy hot take. I just think because of circumstance and the fact that he is just not able to stay healthy and play all 16 and now 17 games in a season. For all that being said, like, I think it's been a little underwhelming. And then last year, again, it was circumstantial. He had a career high in receptions, but he had a career low in yards per reception at 10 even. He had the third lowest yardage total of his career with 592. That's the lowest since 2020. So overall, and that's a lot because the offense was very vanilla. Brian Johnson did not get Dallas Goedert the ball in space in creative ways like Shane Steichen did, like Doug Peterson did. You look at it in that perspective, there weren't as many screens that were successful. It was kind of a lot of dump-offs and just short yardage stuff. Goedert was kind of almost a check-down option in 2023. So for all that being said, and again, he was injured. So I just think he could have, if he was on another team, or if the circumstances in Philly were different, or if he was able to stay healthy for an entire year, there should have been at least one monster Dallas Goedert season. I'm not saying he was going to do what Zach Ertz did consistently year in and year out. But like, you would have thought he'd have at least one Ertz 2018, 2019, maybe even 2017 type of run. And I think he did that in 2021 and 2022, back-to-back really good years. But it wasn't, I still think even in those seasons, he could have been a whole lot more. Like, if he was the Eagles tight end 1 in 2017, considering his yards per reception average, his efficiency, this could be a guy that had over 1,000 yards. I really do believe that. So overall, I was kind of thinking about that and how they need Dallas Goedert this year to be better than he was last year. And again, a lot of that's on coaching. They need to use Dallas Goedert better is maybe the better way to put this. They need to do that because overall throughout his career, like, he hasn't had a terrible career. Philadelphia, I think, is very happy with what he's done in Midnight Green. But for Dallas Goedert himself, I don't know if he's ever truly been able to, and hasn't been able to himself, meet the potential that I think he's capable of if you put him in like a Kyle Shanahan offense or an Andy Reid type of offense. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but that's my Around the Nest, or I should say Thrown Out of the Nest take. Around the Nest was my old podcast when I was a kid. Thrown Out of the Nest, our new segment every Thursday, where we have a bold Eagles take. And I think that's, I would say, pretty bold. I think the majority of Eagles fans would disagree and say that they think Goedert's been a success in Philly. But I just think that there's been a lot of meat on the bones. And I think that's okay. I want Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown to get the ball. But for Dallas, I think there is a parallel universe out there where he's had more of a George Kittle, Travis Kelce kind of arc. Not saying he's an all-time great, but I definitely think there is more there to be had, and there has been throughout his career. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, got some free agent what-ifs going back to this most recent offseason. I love what the Eagles did on paper. It's one of my favorite offseasons, maybe the favorite offseason I've experienced as an Eagles fan and an Eagles analyst. But going back, is there anything that I would change about what Howie Roseman did? I'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. And we are brought to you today. Today's episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by Gametime, which is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app, they actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets, but not just the MLB, the NFL as well. Gametime helped me purchase my Eagles-Saints tickets for September. Headed down to New Orleans with the 4th and John boys. Going to go to my first game at the Superdome. Cannot wait. Gametime got me a great deal, saving up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for sports, comedy, concerts, theaters. Everything can be found on Gametime. Plus, on top of the great prices, you can make sure you're getting a great view. Get a panoramic view of your seat in the app before you buy. They have a lowest price guarantee as well. And if they do not have the lowest price, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets and the NFL this year with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create that account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, got to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you canvas analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So again, as I mentioned earlier, and I've said it on the show before, there might not be an offseason that I was more pleased with the work of Howie Roseman than 2024. And I loved a lot of what he did last year in the 2023 NFL Draft, 2022 getting A.J. Brown, 2016 getting Carson Wentz, like 2019 Deshaun Jackson coming back on paper. I was very happy with that. They've never done what they did this year where there were so many specific moves I wanted, like them getting Quinyon Mitchell, bringing back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, even bringing in Saquon Barkley was something I really liked and entertained that idea. I brought it up before it was on most people's radars because Gino and I were trying to come up with the topic of, or in a specific example of how Howie Roseman this year could zig when the rest of the league is zagging. And we said he could take advantage of the running back market where nobody is paying them now. So you can get a weapon like Saquon for less than or around the same money as a Darnell Mooney from the Atlanta Falcons. So overall, I am thrilled. This is one of my favorite Eagles teams on paper from top to bottom on both sides of the ball. But I will say there's some other moves, like you go back to my offseason simulation, there are some moves that I wanted them to make and they didn't, right? They made the move, so I'm not complaining. Like getting Quinyon Mitchell was enough. They didn't have to do anything else to please me. But there were some other moves that I would have liked to have seen. So if I could go back in time, like what is the one move that you would want the Eagles to do, right? For me, again, there's not like one thing I said, I can't believe they let this guy go. I can't believe they didn't do this, right? They should have done this. But I will say one thing that was on my offseason wish list that I do wish they took a different route or approach on was wide receiver 3. And again, they got Saquon Barkley instead of paying like a Darnell Mooney. So I don't want to say that I wish they would have paid Darnell Mooney instead of a Saquon Barkley, because I think Saquon Barkley is a blue chip player that's going to have a much bigger impact on the Eagles this year than Darnell Mooney would. Like that's just an absolute fact. But at the same time, I wish they would have found a way to upgrade wide receiver 3 better than they did by bringing in, it was at one point Devontae Parker before he retired, and then, of course, bringing in Paris Campbell, drafting Johnny Wilson and Anais Smith. I like that room a lot better than Quez Watkins and Olamide Zaccheaus and Julio Jones from last year. Like, I think they will, at least one of those guys will present an upgrade over those players. But you guys remember all the time, if you listen during the offseason, I would not shut up about the idea of bringing in, like, again, I did like the idea of a Darnell Mooney, and I did hear down at the Senior Bowl the Eagles did have some interest in bringing Mooney in. But Curtis Samuel was like the guy I wanted. And of course, he got more money than I expected to be right now. What, the Buffalo Bills wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2? I thought Curtis Samuel would get more of a wide receiver 3 kind of contract. I think he's shown that he's a high-end wide receiver 3, but I don't think you want him to be a top 2 guy in your offense. So I said, that's perfect. Bringing him in to complement Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown and Dallas Goedert is a really smart move. And he's a versatile guy that's played both running back and wide receiver. In Kellen Moore's new pre-snap motion offense, like, you could use a gadget weapon like that to be called in motion from the slot to the backfield, vice versa. Use him in the screen game. Get him used better in space. All these Eagles players, Kellen Moore is going to use better in space. It's why a lot of us like Anais Smith's potential in this offense. It's the same reason I really liked the idea of Curtis Samuel. Plus, he can return kicks with that new kickoff rule. I think if I can make one move, I can go back in time and do one thing over, it would be the approach at wide receiver. Because I think you could have paid Saquon Barkley and brought in one of those guys. Like, I don't think that was totally unfeasible. Now, again, Mooney and Samuel specifically got more money than I expected, but I would have liked them to bring in somebody better than Devontae Parker and Paris Campbell. I don't know. For me, that was a little too bargain bin hunting for me. And again, I know you have now 4 target monsters, so once you got Saquon Barkley, at that point, it really didn't matter who your receivers were. But at the time, if I could go back in time before they brought in Saquon, a move that I wanted that they did not do, it was bringing in like a Curtis Samuel type of player. I would have really liked to see that, but who knows? Maybe Anais Smith can be that guy. I don't think Curtis Samuel is a very high ceiling to meet in an NFL career. He's had a very underrated and solid career, but I think Anais Smith could absolutely become that player where he's a solid 4th or 5th target in this offense. I think Paris Campbell could potentially be a poor man's version of a Curtis Samuel in this offense. Like, I think between those two, there's a good shot one of them could become that guy. But I would have liked, at the time, I liked the idea, and I still do. Again, not in favor of signing Saquon Barkley, but I would have liked to see a Mooney or Samuel caliber player come into this offense, even if it was a luxury, right? Even if they would have drafted like a Troy Franklin in the 3rd or 4th round, maybe instead of Jalix Hunt. I like Jalix Hunt, but I would have been okay with that 3rd pick being like a Troy Franklin who fell into day 2, day 3 from Oregon when I thought he was potentially somebody that could have been a 1st-round pick. So that's a move I would have liked to see. Another one is I love Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. I love that he's back. It's going to be one of the most underrated moves in the entire NFL offseason. I said that's more impactful even than, it might be the most impactful move the Eagles made this year, even over signing Saquon, drafting Quinyon Mitchell. Quinyon's going to be the most impactful long-term in my opinion, but CGJ this year will make the biggest impact. However, you guys know I really liked Xavier McKinney. He was the top safety on the market. He was somebody the Eagles did have interest in, but Green Bay just outworked them. They just had a better offer, and that's kind of, the Eagles do that. They draw their line in the sand, right? With safety, this is what happened with Marcus Williams in 2022. They had interest. They made an offer. They had to pivot because Baltimore paid him a lot more money. Same thing happened this year. Xavier McKinney, somebody Philadelphia. That was their plan A, I think, over CGJ, who was their plan B. Green Bay paid him a lot of money. But I would have loved to see Xavier McKinney in Vic Fangio's defense. He's a player that I'm very intrigued by. Was a big fan of him at Alabama, coming out, playing for the New York Giants, being a 2nd-round pick. Last year, his numbers were incredible. Like, he is an elite coverage safety. I would have loved to see Xavier McKinney. Plus, he stays healthy, and he is younger than CGJ as well. So I think that would be the two things that, again, I'm not dying to see that happen even next year. I like the moves they made instead, But if there were two moves that I wanted at the time that I would have liked to see, it's bringing in like a Curtis Samuel type of receiver and trying to land the big fish safety at Xavier McKinney. But I think they got the next best thing in Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, who we know in Philadelphia has an elite ceiling if he does stay healthy. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles, what's the move the Eagles made this offseason that has the most risk that I'm concerned might not work out, like has the highest chance of not working out? We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, Eagles fans, we are wrapping up this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, and we've been talking about free agency again, a couple moves that I would have liked to see. Again, the Eagles did almost everything I wanted them to this offseason, especially in free agency, the draft as well. Again, though, I would like to see like another wide receiver move, bringing in like a Curtis Samuel or a Darnell Mooney type, maybe Xavier McKinney, like getting the big fish free agent at safety, although I love bringing back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Those are some of the things that I would have liked to see, but again, I'm not heartbroken over that. So I want to get into now, to wrap up the show, a move that they did make that might have the most like boom or bust potential, like the one that might end up being that move we look back on and say, ooh, we loved that at the time, but man, did that not work out. Like, which one has the most bust potential, the riskiest signing? And I think you could say, like, some of their cheaper moves, like bringing in a Devin White, that might not work out, or maybe, like, you know, signing Bryce Huff. Maybe he doesn't become an every down player. Like, there's a risk to that. But I also think there's a certain floor with those guys as well. And I'm not saying that Saquon Barkley doesn't have a floor. We know that Saquon Barkley is an incredible running back. But I will say at the same time that of all the moves they did make this year, like if one is a disaster, I'd probably predict it's the overpaying a running back that's over 26 years old, that has an injury history. Even if, you know, he does end up being somebody that produces, like, will it be enough better than Miles Sanders or DeAndre Swift where it was worth getting $12 million a year? Like, will he meet that potential? Because to become that guy, to make it worth $12 million, he not only has to put up like Miles Sanders, DeAndre Swift numbers, which are good. If he does that, that's a solid year. But I think this is a bad move unless he becomes somebody that has over 1,000 rushing yards, has over 500 receiving yards, is a legitimate Christian McCaffrey-like producer for this offense. Like, that is the only way a $12 million deal is worth it. Like, that's just a fact, because if not, you could have just brought back DeAndre Swift or somebody else for a lot cheaper. So I think of all the moves that Howie Roseman did make this year, if one comes back to bite him, although I love the execution of it, or I shouldn't say execution, I love the idea of it, I love the philosophy and the risk. Like, I like being bold and the aggression of bringing in Saquon Barkley. Like, I love everything about it. I will say at the same time, I don't think that of all the moves, like, I don't think this is the one that you can guarantee it's going to work out. And none of them could be that. You could end up saying, oh, Quinyon Mitchell was an absolute bust, or Cooper DeJean was, or, oh, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson couldn't stay healthy this year. Like I said, Bryce Huff isn't an every down producer. But gun to my head, if one move has bust potential, as much as I love the Saquon Barkley move, and I'm so excited to see him in an Eagles jersey this year, and I think he really can take this offense to a new level in Kellen Moore's offense, at the same time, I think that it could also blow up in their face. Like, there's been times the Eagles and other teams have overpaid for an older running back based on his past production, and it doesn't really work out. So for me, that's probably the move I'd say has the most bust potential. I would also say trading Hassan Reddick away is the one that can blow up in their face the most. If this pass rush doesn't get back to who they were 2 years ago, and Hassan Reddick does dominate with the New York Jets, if he ends up ever playing, that's another one, of course, that could blow up. But I will say Saquon Barkley is the most boom or bust potential that you could say of these offseason moves. Like, that is the one that is the riskiest for sure. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in and making us your first listen each and every day. We will be back tomorrow to wrap up this week of shows. Until then, though, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. Thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.